Hello and welcome to a special edition of Rates and Barrels. Today we have co-parent of Stuff Plus, Max Bay, on the line. Max is back with us in the public sphere. Say hello, Max. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everybody. How you know? About myself. Lifelong baseball fan. Um, I did a PhD in neuroscience from 2015 to 2022, which tells you something about how terrible a PhD can be. But while I was there, doing a lot of high-dimensional statistics and modeling, machine learning, etc. And my baseball enthusiasm kind of bled over into, my analytical work and vice versa. And kind of just, a hobby grew out of that. It's like a tale as old as time at this point. So, a lot of the public work that was out there, I read things that I found, particularly interesting that I want to understand thoroughly. I tried to replicate, and yeah, that sort of just blossomed into a more, I guess, serious pursuit of answering baseball questions and coming up with baseball questions. That's pretty much it. So yeah, that's like the backstory. And one day, somebody from a team from the Astros reached out to me and had a really compelling conversation about what it'd be like working for a team, what it would be like in the organization, etc. And so did that for a little while, really loved it. But for a number of reasons, I decided to leave and am now sort of in a non-baseball role for the first time in a while. So the dust's kind of settling, and yeah, that's my life story.
What were the particular skills that that stood out for the organization when they were looking at what you could do? What was your best foot forward? In other words.
Yeah, for me personally, I think this story will be different for just about everyone. But for me, it was sort of the marriage of really, really loving baseball, being very curious about what makes it tick. What dials can you turn? What knobs? Wait, dials can you? Yeah, you turn dials. Yeah, right. Anyway, what can you manipulate to change your chances? And how do you evaluate things in the first place? And so, being curious about all that stuff, and then having like a programming background and a technical expertise that, or at least like technical familiarity level that's sufficient to start to ask those questions like with computers, because you just have so much data. You really have to, process these things like on a machine, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would say the other thing is having a like pretty robust machine learning exposure also. So these tools that can take large quantities of data with like very complicated interactions, and make predictions about the future given input and all that. So all that stuff I think kind of what was the thing that kind of stood out.
Our baby Stuff Plus is out in the world now, and
Okay.
there's a lot of different versions of it now. I don't know. Have you stayed up on that? Could you sort of quickly analyze like some of the differences in the models in terms of structure, and maybe just describe to me how much we're fighting over here? Are we fighting over our tiny little decimal points? Are they? You think the models are distinctly different? I mean, the teams have models like this too, so you could almost expand it to a discussion of like how different stuff models are across the league, or if you're aware of that. But you also,
Not because only work for one team.
yeah, right. But from what
Um,
you've seen in the public space, like how different are these models, and what are some of the structural differences?
yeah, so broadly the models are all really similar. I would say that the two different um, pitch grader sort of implementations at a very high level tend to be either regression or classification models. So the regression model, it takes all the input, how hard you threw the ball, what the movement was, maybe things relative to other pitches in your arsenal, where you threw it from, etc. And the prediction for a regression model is to map that into expected run value dimension, right? Like this one number from basically negative infinity up to positive infinity. But realistically, numbers are like per pitch thrown, somewhere between like, I actually don't really know, it depends on the count, but like negative 0.5 and 0.5, say something like that. And when you do that, there's basically a direct mapping of the pitch values onto run value. The classification models are a little bit different, similar in their super similar in their goal, but how they get there are they're kind of 3 steps. So there's the inputs, and then the inputs, instead of going straight to run value, they map onto outcomes. So they give you a probability of, a swing or called strike, or however you structure it, probability of a whiff, probability of putting it in play. And then there's a run value assigned to each event. And then the idea is basically to just get the weighted average of the run values across where the weights are the probabilities of the event. So broadly, those seem to be the 2 kinds of like pitch graders that are out there. You get some additional functionality with the classifiers because you can look at things like expected whiff, right? Because the probabilities are in there for the individual events. You're not just limited to the run value metric, right? Like you can look at the stuff, so to speak, that's on the way to the actual run value. But yeah, and then there's obviously like the difference between a pitching plus type model and a stuff type model, right? Where the generally how stuff's done is you just take away the location features and maybe the count features, and
what's left.
Yeah, and it's just saying like broadly over the like marginal distribution of these things, how would this pitch perform? And yeah, those are the basic frameworks. The differences between the different models are really hard to say, because these models are actually very they're complicated in ways that you wouldn't really understand totally, unless you did this type of modeling. But what I can say is there are things like, for extreme gradient boosting, which is like a very common machine learning framework that's used for these types of models. You can put limits on the number of trees that it will make. You can make it learn faster or slower. You can run, because this model is basically iteratively improving. You can run it like over some truncated amount of time. You can run it forever. So that's just within extreme gradient boosting. But then there's like a very similar gradient boosting machine type framework called Cat Boost. And there are neural nets. There are always all these ways to do that. And what I'd say is that those things I described that you can tune for XGB, for the extreme gradient boosting, like there are similar but slightly different versions of that for each one of these models. And the other thing is there are different frameworks people have. Sometimes people have a separate model for each component of what's happening. So there'll be a swing model and then a called strike model. If they did swing, then there'll be a different model for basically did they whiff or foul it, and then if they or whiff or make contact, and then a different model for foul or put in play, and then and then if you put it in play, there's another model. So
does that run up on any sort of computing issues, like computing capabilities? Does it start to get?
And I would say that like these models and computers in particular are so advanced now that not really. Like a person on a laptop can run this sort of stuff pretty efficiently. I mean, like the original Stuff Plus I put together in my like 2015 MacBook, and I would run the entire season in like 2 minutes, so it didn't take very long. But
yeah, we haven't run into anything yet. There have been some decisions that we've made that are not necessarily the kinds of decisions you're talking about. They're a little bit more almost like philosophical questions that,
Yeah.
so, we didn't put platoon splits in Stuff Plus at first, partially thinking because we're going to put it in Pitching Plus, right? Like we thought that evaluating the platoon split of a pitch meant more when you were evaluating the entire arsenal than when maybe you were evaluating just the pitch itself. Was that kind of our thinking, I think?
Yeah, and it was sort of, with all this stuff, like their assumptions. And
Yeah.
so the assumption really early on was, you know, I was curious how a pitch would perform in general, but that doesn't
Mhm.
mean that it will necessarily be deployed to the same amount for each platoon. What
Yeah.
the model's effectively learning when you train it is what the usage is. And so I thought like it would just kind of figure out what the platoon.
Because this is a pitch that doesn't get used against this way, right? So it's
Yeah,
like,
and so it's not in the training set, so it doesn't learn as much about that.
yeah.
That's ultimately, yeah, like a kind of it's quasi philosophical thing, quasi a quantifiable thing, because you could just make the model with the platoon, see if it performs better predictably.
Well, that's what we ended up doing, and we
Yeah,
ended up putting it into Stuff Plus again because while you were out,
yeah,
we ended up putting
sure.
it back in because it improved the model. And I think one way that you see it playing out is you. I hate to read too much into this, but you might have had a bunch of models out there that did not have platoon splits in their models that was spitting out how great sweepers were. We had some organizations that just basically taught sweepers to every pitcher that came up.
Yeah,
And now we have a fair amount of pitchers out in the big leagues realizing they can't throw their sweeper to the opposite hands, and they need to figure something else out on top of it. So
right.
as we go and bumble along in Stuff Plus, so do teams. And I wonder what the future is for us in these terms. I have a little fun thing that you've put together, where you're looking at acceleration, and you're going to have to explain to me acceleration here. But for those who are watching on YouTube, you can see the different acceleration in Luis Castillo's changeup and four seamer. And so the red is just like the league average population. The yellow is what you would expect Castillo's pitch to be just based on release characteristics,
Just based on release point.
just on point, just not even you're not even doing release angles or anything, just the
No,
release
it's
point.
XYZ where it was released in space. Yeah,
And then green is observed,
yeah.
which is something I've been fascinated with for a long time. I guess one question is, do you think this is in Stuff Plus? And if it is, what can this lead us down? What sort of pathway can this lead us down that might help us improve Stuff Plus?
So I think to answer the question about whether this is in Stuff Plus, um, the short answer is kind of. So Stuff Plus has a number of predictor variables. So these are the features of a pitch that are used to estimate its quality, or its quality is estimated from the features. And where it's released in space is it's actually three of the features, right? Because it's XYZ where it's released in space.
And some of the most important features in the model, actually.
Exactly. Yeah. If you hold everything else constant and then you change where it's released, you're going to get different qualities.
Yeah.
So there's a dependency on where you release it and the quality. And mechanistically, I think people have a pretty good understanding of this now. You get it really low. If you have a really low release point, but you got a ton of ride, you have a couple things going for you. You're no longer throwing the pitch down into the zone. It's going straight. And you aren't like matching the upward bat angle of the bat. And so the collision is offline from the ball. And so there's some mechanistic like explanations for why the grader would see the performance dip or change. So when I say that it's kind of in the model, what I mean is that we tell the model that it was released from this point, and it's clearly sensitive to those features, right? And this is, I think, true for like basically all the public graders.
Mm-hmm.
For me, the interesting thing, and the reason I do this work like in my free time, is so that I understand it. It's not just to
Mm.
build a predictive model. If I had like a predictive model that like could perfectly describe baseball, I'd be proud of it. It'd be interesting, but I would not be satisfied in my understanding of baseball. The machine now understands baseball. I don't. You know?
Actually, that's one thing that I would like to do more with Stuff Plus is, we've got the shiny that shows some of the interactions to kind of use it to have some takeaways. Like I think that's what you were describing here a little bit is like
Yeah,
it's frustrated me that it's a black box. It is a black box because it's machine learning, and so all these different features are interacting in all these different ways that I can't just be like, fastball go burr. Although you can, I mean, like velo is a really important piece of the model. So as we
definitely.
can make little things like this, we can better understand the takeaways to help people sort of spot it on their own in the wild, I guess.
Yeah, and I also think just like these models aren't perfect. They have large residuals, so they make a prediction, and then there's errors off that prediction, and that error isn't just noise from sampling. That
Hmm.
error is like sticky within player between seasons. So if a player is under predicted, in whiffs or in whatever, you've seen this, like it will usually that's like important signal.
Hmm.
Um, and so the way I guess I have been thinking about this more recently is that like let's say you have like a Bayesian understanding of things, but there's some prior, and then you have your data, basically your observation. And then the thought is, well, how likely was these observations, or how likely is my prior given these observations? And then you have your posterior, which is like your new understanding of things. And the way I think about the pitch graders now is, well, actually, what it does is it establishes a really like useful, informative prior. So instead of the prior being, this is an average pitcher, it'll say, well, I'll look at their pitch features and see how they look. But their performance is like additional information that is useful in understanding that pitcher. Um, so yeah, I think one of the reasons I want to understand this stuff is because it's not just, oh, I want to improve Stuff Plus. It's Stuff Plus tells you something, or Pitching Plus or whatever, they tell you something, but there's other unexplained sources of variance, and
Hmm.
it's not all going to be explained. But the satisfying thing about doing this, and why like any of us do this in our free time, is getting an understanding of it. And so for me, part of that was understanding what it means for a pitch to have an expected movement profile.
Hmm.
I think we take for granted what it means is that it's like the angle off the arm slot basically, and maybe that's
Hmm.
it. The other thing is it's not a point. People don't expect necessarily a point. There's like a range that it could be, and that's the most likely range. And if you've got a really surprising pitch, it'll be off of that. And
Hmm.
so for me, that was part of why I wanted to build this out, because you could now characterize like a surprise pitch in probabilistic terms. Like this is a really unlikely shape given where it
Mm.
should be, based off your slot.
Yeah, I can understand that. It's a little bit like my quest for understanding better how pitches within an arsenal interact. Um, I did
Yeah,
try
yeah,
and look
that's
at
like,
some of the underperformers and overperformers. And when you do binning, you can kind of be like, oh, look, in these bins, you find a lot of people who underperform their stuff plus that have fewer pitches, and people who
yeah,
overperform their stuff plus. And yet when we try to put, you know, number of pitches into the model, it doesn't make anything more predictive. So um, it's something that can help you understand it better. And from the outside, if you're trying to use the model, you can you can sort of adjust those shades of gray a little bit and say, hey, like this player over here that we're scouting, or this player that I'm thinking about picking up, the stuff plus isn't amazing, but he does have like 5 pitches, and it seems like he can command them. This type of player may not, pop in this model in the same way that his usability might be out there for the big leagues, or for my fantasy team. So um, as we and then at some point there may be something about the interaction. And that's what's fun about this too, is that there could be an interaction between expected shapes within an arsenal. And so then we could
Yes.
better understand, even maybe within the context of Stuff Plus. But one thing that I've always struggled with Stuff Plus is if you think we should put more sort of derived stats in. I mean, one thing that I'd like about Stuff Plus is it's mostly just like raw stats. It's like raw movement, velo and stuff like that. We haven't put something like vertical approach angle in because we're hoping that by weighting release points so importantly and knowing the shapes of the pitches, that if the model thinks the VAA is good, it'll be in there. The stuff that goes into VAA.
Yeah, it's like redundant representation a little bit.
Right. So if we put VAA in on top of it, then we risk overloading that aspect. We've got VAA and its components in the model separately,
Yeah, and maybe it's worthwhile throwing it in there. You just got to toy around with these things, and you can either do that in an objective or subjective way. Like you could have it kind of like build out the same model with different combinations of features and do it this is a nice thing about computers. They'll just do this stuff for you. So.
Right. Just iterate it and see if it's worth it. We do have some derived stats in there. Like first we have spin efficiencies in there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually that's a stat that's taken out of context and made into something new and put back.
It's like a feature constructed from the other features. And so there's definitely some redundant representation there too. Because like in order to get certain types of shape off of a certain arm angle, you'd have to have an inefficient, release, like a cut type four-seamer with a little bit of cut. It's got to be a little inefficient. And so, like that information is kind of there. We're redundantly
because we have spin in there and we have movement in there. So ergo, on some level, we have spin efficiency in there.
Exactly. So maybe you don't need it.
Yeah.
but the other thing is like, I think generally these sorts of things don't really move the needle at all. I think that the things that really move the needle, maybe this is something you will bring up later, but the things that kind of move the needle are bigger than that. It's not just do I throw this extra feature in there. It has, I think, more to do with what you do with the values after you've created them.
Mm-hmm. Well, lastly on this, on the subject of Stuff Plus and its future, I guess I'm wondering if we're waiting on any metrics that would improve them. I think the reason we have spin efficiency there on some level is that it's possible that lower spin efficiency pitches move differently over the course of ball flight than high spin efficiency, or at least high magnus. You know what I mean? Like high spin efficiency means that you've got a kind of a magnus force on it, which was usually sort of up or down, and that's what makes curveballs go down and four seamers go up. Generally, I know
parallel to the direction of movement of
like
the flight of the ball. Yeah.
But when you become spin efficiency, now when you become less spin efficient, you have some spin that's not turning into movement.
Yeah.
But over the course of the flight of the ball, the trajectory of the ball might catch some of that before useless spin. Like, you know what I mean? Like it starts to catch some of that spin. And in other words, gyro cutters, gyro sliders, some of them might have late movement in a way that may not be captured by the model that just sort of sees broad movement, like movement over time.
Like in theory, the movement profile, if like, let's say you have a gyro ball, perfect gyro ball, right? Like no vertical.
Perfect gyro ball means none of the spin is turning into movement, and it's moving just like a bullet through space, basically.
Exactly. And so on a movement plot, it would be 0, 0. It'd be right at the origin, right? Right in the center. So the model, it could learn a bit about how performance on that shape, what performance on that shape sort of looks like. Because that ball by definition has 0 spin efficiency. So you still might not need the spin efficiency value in there. But I do think separately, something that I've been thinking about a bit, and I posted something about this. It's not new or anything at all, but like I was just curious about spin efficiency is actually like a dynamic thing over the flight of a ball.
Yeah.
So if you imagine like you throw, just using the classic example of the gyro slider, the the spin vector is going actually the direction of the pitch. It's sort of what the definition of perfectly inefficient spin is, right? So it's like this, and so they're both moving like this, and the spin vector stays like this, but the ball starts to fall down,
Right.
right? And so it becomes kind of spin efficient, and it actually gets some Magnus force moving it at the end of its flight. How
And that may
much?
be different based on release characteristics and
It's
release
different depending
angles,
on how much time it has to fall, basically.
velocity.
Yeah, so how hard you throw it means it has more time to fall.
Yeah.
And then also, if you throw it more up, it will also have more time to fall.
So
Because
extension matters. Yeah, extension matters. Velocity matters. Velocity
yeah,
means more time to change angle,
to show, but to like
more or less time.
actually show, like this hasn't been demonstrated to my knowledge. The actual late movement. And when I say late movement, I mean like acceleration that doesn't occur until later because it can't, because the spin efficiency
I've
isn't.
only I've only
Yeah,
seen it sort of discussed in these types of ways, like
exactly.
in
But
theoretical ways. And so,
you
are
need
we
the like
waiting
super
for?
high speed cameras, and then to show the deviation from the like the null trajectory. And yeah, that's how you show
But
it.
that would be, so that's like sort of a research based idea, and it's out there for anybody who has the capabilities. It is not super easy, but there are some labs out there. I mean, if
Drive lunch
Barton
to do it.
Smith is listening, I'm sure Barton Smith could do this.
Yeah, have them do it.
But are we also waiting for? Are there possible Hawkeye metrics that they could give us that may come out someday that would tell us more about the movement in space, or are they mostly just a beginning and end point movement system as well?
So when it comes to like the spin efficiency stuff, I don't think there's anything right now that you're gonna like that's being captured that's embargoed by the public. I think the thing that people are waiting on is some of the biomechanics of pitching. You know how that could, like the backtracking stuff, for example, is very derivative. Like there's like this very raw, like bat handle and head, and then they have to take the velocity at a particular time, and that's what you get, velocity at a particular time. The biomechanics are like that. It's the tracking of an individual over time, but maybe there's some important features in that they would release publicly that would be useful in evaluating pitchers that heretofore has not existed.
Yeah, one thing I've been saying is, changeups seem to lag for us a little bit, and one thing that would be nice is arm speed. I did have a discussion with someone, arm speed as separate from hand speed, or even arm angle, something about that forearm angle as it comes through. I think that maybe hitters can spot changeups based on some biomechanical characteristics. Someone then said, "Well, is that stuff or is that deception?" And I was like, I think at its core, it's really hard to pull deception out from stuff. I think that's what was a real sort of eye-opening moment for us when we saw that how important release point was in features. Like that might be quote unquote deception, but in the end, we're talking about what makes pitches good. And if deception and stuff are not really separate things, then
Yeah,
we don't, let's not get bogged down in like, is that stuff? Then I don't, I think I'd rather just make a good pitch grader than worry about what is stuff versus deception.
yeah, it's all about making a good pitch, however you get
Yeah.
there.
All right. So the backtracking stuff came out, and you mentioned that we kind of got the pre-chewed stuff, and I think that makes sense because first of all, the clients of MLBAM are pretty much broadcasters, I think, and they're writers, and there's no way that they would be served well by just releasing a bunch of dimensions and velocities and angular notations and stuff. So like, you know, for their consumers, this made the most sense. But so leaving aside how we can improve them, just given what we have now, you know, do you think you have any sort of best practices for people where they should be looking, what kinds of value they can get out of these metrics as they stand?
Oh wow, I'm going to give a terrible answer to this, which is I have not thought about this enough.
Right.
My move out of baseball was recent enough for the dust to not quite have settled. So my exposure to what is out there
Uh-huh.
is like medium level. But I could say this. The things that have been released, which are essentially, to my understanding, bat velocity, so
Swing
bat
length.
speed. Yeah, and then this metric they're calling swing length, which is basically the cumulative distance that the barrel of a bat traveled from time point A to time point B.
Mhm.
Those are, because of the way they defined it, actually not independent of other important things. So it's not just a, I would like if you were to explain this in model terms, you wouldn't say that there's just a player effect,
Mhm.
right? There's also no
We
effect.
haven't boiled down to things that have been so like we haven't boiled down to like the rawest thing.
Yeah. So here's why: because contact. So bat speed is defined as, I may get this wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. Bat speed is defined as on contact, the velocity of the bat in the frame immediately preceding contact.
Yeah.
So if you get same pitch, same location, same shape, same everything. If you make contact at different parts of your swing, which have different velocities, because the velocity changes, right? It starts at 0. At different parts of your swing, it will have different velocity. So
Mhm.
where you make contact matters. Now, if you do not make contact, it's defined as the velocity in the frame where the barrel of your bat is closest to the pitch in space. The pitch is moving in time, so moving over time. So again, like if you whiff, depends. So like if you whiff and you're early or if you whiff and you're late, you'll have different velocity readings, even if like the shape of your swing was the same, but it started at different times. So what I
Yeah.
mean to say is it's not controlled in a way where you're, um, by looking at just the raw values, able to make super precise claims about a player's swing.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, you do the average. If you just look at average bat speed, the stratification makes sense. And it's like probably really close to like their bat speed controlling for some location in their swing or
Mhm.
something. But they're important sources of variance that people have looked at. I think that Steven Sutton Brown he posted something without like even really explaining it very much. And I was like, dude, this is what you're gonna do. Which is basically build out a model that attempts to control for where it was in space. Um,
Does
and
pitches
and
high
the
in the
count.
zone get shorter swings because
Exactly.
they have to, because you have to get your bat there, you have to be shorter.
Yes.
And pitches out in front of the plate get higher velos, like you mentioned, higher velos and higher swing lengths just because of where they are in your swing. They're in front of the plate.
Yeah.
And you
So
could
if you
probably
want like a
use pull percentage and pitch height to kind of control for a couple of those variables a little bit.
exactly. And so I think, what we're kind of waiting on for like some really precise characterizations at the player level are things that control for that stuff. And then basically say, given what pitches you saw and what count they
Mhm.
were in and all that stuff, how much faster was your swing than the average? How much slower was your swing than the average? So it's kind
Mhm.
of controlling for those variables and then saying over expected how much faster are you. And the stratification would probably be super similar, but this matters for players with not that many swings, right? Where the context, like where it was thrown.
It's very much, it reminds me a lot of like sort of like Stuff Plus, where
Exactly. Yeah.
very beginning, when you have very little sample and you just like a guy just debuted or something, you can say more about him using these bat tracking metrics than you can about his results, but that is ever shifting towards results. And there will be people that have great quote unquote swings. Jesus Sanchez right now has the same swing length and same bat speed as Gunnar Henderson. And you're just like, I don't think that means Jesus Sanchez is as good as Gunnar Henderson.
Yeah, and I'd be curious to see if that is holds true once you control for some of these other things. I bet it pretty much does. But it's, I think there's a reason for this type of precision. And one of those reasons is if you want to track changes within a season, for example, then you really want to control the noise.
Yeah, you don't want to. This guy's pulling the ball more. Oh, his swing just got longer. No, he's just pulling the ball more.
Just came back from injury. Like, does this look different?
Yeah.
Well, you want to control for the stuff that has nothing to do with their injury.
Yeah.
Or
would it have been better though if they had just picked a fixed place and time? And
it's hard. It's hard. I will say that this is a challenging problem
because not everyone stands the same place as the
yes,
plate,
I mean,
right?
you could. Okay, so like you could stand like this. Wow, this is not going to be useful, especially for people only listening.
But you could stand right at the plate, like sort
exactly.
of with one leg in front, one leg behind, basically. Like you'd like sort of right.
You could stand like basically so that your body, like your legs are pointing towards the pitcher, or they could be angled a little bit back. And so where you are in your swing, maybe a different location in actual space for different hitters. And so it's a tough problem. There's also the problem of like when you make contact, the bat has to slow down because it's now encountering the momentum of the ball. And so
you're going to say that the bat speed is higher on all the whiffs. That's like a weird thing to say.
Yeah. And then you get some funky correlations. And so it's just, it's a complicated problem. I totally appreciate why the data are represented the way they are. I think just as the consumer, you just want to be aware of those things and be on the lookout for some work that can help clean it up a little bit.
Yeah, I think one thing that was cool was at the beginning, Kyle Bland did swing length plus swing speed into a swing acceleration. And that's already, I like that. Now, if you can take swing acceleration and then account for pitch location, maybe pitch speed, but definitely pitch location and pull rate, something like that. I think you could maybe get a sense of acceleration over average, like you're saying, or acceleration over some sort of baseline.
I also know that down the line, there is planned to put into production like contact point or the vertical bat angle, which is basically the angle the bat is moving, like the barrel of the bat is moving with respect to up down, stuff like that. But even that is going to change over right? Like a bat kind of goes down and up. So the vertical bat angle is going to change too. So where you do that measurement matters. But as these new metrics kind of trickle out, I think the community is strong and we'll figure out how to squeeze the most information out of what's there.
Yeah. Would be nice to see a contact point in the future. That might be the easiest way to help us along. But it's still exciting, like it's still a fun new suite of pitches. And I know from what I know within organizations that, this is a place where there's still disagreement in organizations. I know organizations that have bat path grades and, half the people there are like, I don't know if it's any good, like, there's a guy, DK Willardson, who wrote a book about how VBA is everything on quantitative hitting. You can read that, but I would read it with a little bit of suspicion because he's kind of seized on one metric. Anytime I know I'm a stuff plus guy, but like anytime you seize on one metric and you think that's, and you don't seem to really pick at it and find any flaws in it, then I get a little suspicious of you. Like I don't think VBA is the answer to everything hitting. And there
are important correlations there. I think I really like that book, but yeah, the conclusions are very different from the methodology. you know,
Yeah.
two parts to it. And the methodology is really cool because it like parameterizes the swing or characterizes the swing in a way that you could numerically represent. And you know how important this stuff is. Like, I think that's up for debate, but how the characterizations are suggested in terms of like lift and loft and, you know, stuff like that. I think it's some intriguing things that will be brought back, like
Mhm.
things in that book that were mentioned. I'm sure that language that will enter the lexicon.
It's true. I mean, we're now entering a space where we're gonna have to talk about things. I talked to a hitting coach, and he said his favorite stat in the lexicon that was available to him was one that described how low the bat gets in the back, and it's basically almost like a barrel dumping a stat or something. It's about like the lowness. It's a little bit about, it's a kind of an angle. It's like a kind of a vertical band angle like stat, but it was called like SBA
Yeah,
or something. I don't know, but like it was about how low it gets in the back. And I think, yeah, I think some of what Wilson did helps us talk about stuff like that. It helps us
exactly.
talk about
Yeah,
how, what, what are the words we should use? What are the ways we should even describe this? I do recommend the book. I just don't think that VBA is necessarily everything.
yeah,
And
I
we don't
agree.
even have that. We haven't even started arguing about that yet. That's
Yeah,
just coming down the pike.
yeah.
All right. So, one thing is like people always ask me is like, how do people get into baseball? And we've been talking about this a little bit back and forth about the different skills that you had. But one way that I would like to think about it is putting together the two different themes in this podcast so far of, where different stats are going and how to get into baseball. Where do you think there are sort of easy inroads for young analysts? And what types of approach, even if it comes down to like even saying like, is it Python or R? Do you think they should be focusing more on neural networks or machine learning? Where we've given them some hints, but where do you think they could take numbers that are out there right now and make an impact and sort of make a name for themselves?
Um, yeah, I think so. Well, you know, I just have my story. And so maybe I should just sort of tell that story briefly, and then get into that. So I was just genuinely interested in these baseball questions that were floating around at the time.
Mhm.
Um, Things like trying to understand which players are potentially going to be impacted by um, a dead end ball, like which hitters will see the biggest drop. 'Cause it's not like it's the same effect for everyone. The effect will be concentrated in certain types of players. Um, Things like how do you model up a pitch based on physical characteristics alone? Um, and there's a lot of really great work out there. Just kind of read it. In some cases replicated it. In some cases tried to like expand on it.
Hmm.
Um, and so I just put my stuff out there. Um,
By the way, if I can interject really quickly, I think reading is how I got to where I am in my job. If anybody cares about that, I printed out every single link that Rob Nair wrote, that Rob Nair put in his linkathons back in the day, and read every single one of those and would write pieces that just link to them as well. So reading and linking and just sort of becoming part of the community, I think, is definitely part of the answer.
Yeah, and like so often the wheel is reinvented, and that's fine, for like gaining your own understanding of things. I'm sure I've reinvented the wheel myself many times. Um, Not to say that what I did was as important as the wheel. Like reinventing the tiny little screw that fits in this little piece of something. But anyway, um, but like being just kind of like just read stuff, man. I don't know.
Mhm.
And your interests will are self-guiding, right? Like they will take you where you want to go. It's pretty clear where the pockets are. So anyway, I was trying to make this short, but of course I go way too long.
Would you leave R behind?
Oh, like the R and Python thing?
Yeah.
No.
No?
What? People are crazy.
I don't know.
Use what language is most suitable for you. So if you don't have familiarity with R or Python necessarily, R is actually like lower entry point for understanding, a
Mhm.
little bit easier to use. It's not as general purpose, it's not as flexible, so there's some limitations. But once you understand enough about R, you could make the leap to Python.
Would there be
Um,
somebody in the Astros front office that just did an R? Worked in
I
R?
cannot answer that question.
Okay. Would there be someone in a theoretical front office that would just work in R and that'd be
Absolutely,
fine?
absolutely, yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. And so I don't think that puts like a yeah, it may for some organizations put a hard constraint on you. Maybe I
Uh-huh.
just answered the question right there. But yeah, I think between those two things, between R Python, and there are definitely other languages.
Yeah.
Just but both are actually great. R is a little easier, so if you want to lower an entry point that's a little easier, R may be great for you.
There's there's some stuff that's available to you. Bill Petty has a baseball with R package
Yeah,
that's
it's called the baseball package, baseball and then the letter R.
yeah. And
And
then
that is, yeah, I mean, it's actually like the linchpin for so much baseball research, particularly because there are scraping functions where you can like load all of the data pretty much.
yeah, I
And
believe
it's
we use
very
it in part of ours. Um but there's also baseball with R, I believe, a book.
um
Uh let me see it.
yeah,
Max Marchi.
Jim Albert,
Analyzing baseball data with R. I believe
yes,
that's
the Jim
a
Albert
Max
book.
Marchi book.
Yeah, it's yeah, and that's there are a few authors on that one.
Yeah.
There's a free version of that, version 3, that's available for free online, and it is awesome. Um, Nothing's going to teach you everything. If you learned everything, then you would have no reason to do any research. But it equips you with, I think, the programming and the plotting, statistical analysis tools that you need to like kind of pursue your own stuff.
Okay, so let's end with an interesting question that I was asked by Niv Shah, the founder of Autonew. He asked me if if I could put the team together, you know, me in the public space, just using publicly available data and whatever, you know, we could get off Savant and whatever we could put together. You know, how would my team do? And I wonder if we can talk about that without getting into any specifics of any organization we're just at, but just to think about, um, you know, the quality of stats you saw inside the game versus the quality with, you know, of the work outside the game. And then also, I guess what I would say is that what somebody could bring to this theoretical team that may not every team might not be good at is um, sort of good business tactics in terms of a good organizational workflow, a good org chart, good communication, good um, you know, sort of using benchmarks to inform processes, like good process. If you could, you know, I know enough about different teams that I can say not every team has good process and good communication. So how do you think this how do you think this team of public analysts armed with baseball savant could do in baseball?
I think you do pretty well. I think really like so much of what makes a team work or not is, as you say, just good communication. And
Hmm.
I don't think that means imposing your view and doing that in a clear way. Communication should be a two-way street where you're learning from the people you're talking with, you gain their trust,
Mm.
and vice versa. So I think at all levels, you establish credibility by like being a good person and by listening and by making products that people believe because over time you've shown that like they're effective and you've shown that you take input seriously. And so
Mm.
if if the organization like had really 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 good quantitative tools, like understood the game analytically super well, and then they imposed their ideas um, in like a draconian way where you don't gain the trust of the coaches, where you don't interact with them. First of all, you're going to miss important stuff because coaches are aware of tons of things that are not like available in the data.
Mm.
And
And then you'll get a lot of pushback where your stuff is not actually implemented because people are just rolling their eyes at you.
exactly, yeah. And so there you go. So you could say you try to implement it, but then it just won't be.
Yeah.
So the data matters. It totally matters. And
Uh-huh.
you, obviously it matters.
Yeah.
Um, but I think that you have to be not just sensitive to the recipients, but also really take their input. So I'd say like you could do pretty well because there are probably some teams out there that like just don't have that communication, and that's your competition. So your
Right.
performance is just relative to who your competition is.
There's also a hidden advantage actually in this theoretical framework that we've created, which is that I'd be building from zero, from scratch. And so
Right.
that's actually, there's some advantage to that,
Mm,
where what happens with every team is they're a little bit of an amalgamation of all the different GMs they've ever had. There's still little ghosts in the framework
yeah.
of, like, Bobby Cox is still in Atlanta somewhere in that system. They're still saying things that people have come before, like who was I can't think of the pitching coach that was blown away guy that I grew up with in Atlanta. But anyway, there's still these sort of vestiges left over.
Yeah.
And in our new one, we could just create a new system from scratch and maybe theoretically at least, have something that worked better for our modern time than some of the old systems that are still in place.
Yeah, the institutional inertia is gone. And so
Yeah.
that's like both a good and a bad thing, probably. But
We
like
would lose some institutional knowledge that other
exactly.
organizations had.
But yeah, I think what I mean to say might, kind of hurt answer or terse, whatever, is that there's, first of all, that's a very rich information resource. And there's a lot of like coachable things on there. There's a lot of decision making related stats in there, obviously, and you could probably go really far, especially if there's good cohesion, there's good communication with people. But it's a game of inches, and often the reason you have R&D is because there's competitive advantage in having your own information. And so, and when I say information, I don't mean your own data, but your own data processing kind of mechanisms. And
On some level, like it would be hard for us to make trades and win trades
yeah,
because everybody would know how we were evaluating. This is something that's true for like fantasy people. It's like if we all have the same access to the same data and we're all trying to make trades, I find the trade making to be harder than ever these days.
right. Like maybe it'd be hard to win first place or whatever in your league, but you'd probably be better. You'd probably, if you just like stuck to your guns and followed a sound methodology. I mean, my guess is obviously sometimes you're going to be pretty bad, but on average, over like however many seasons you play, you're probably pretty good.
Yeah, I think we could do something a little bit like what the A's do,
Right.
because, and I think about this too because I feel like people know exactly what the A's want now in prospects.
Right.
You want somebody who's like between AAA and the majors, who's very projectable. Like I could probably call up Steamer, look through my Steamer projected prospects in my organization, and figure out pretty
Right.
quickly who you want and who I
Yeah.
don't necessarily care. Like it's fine if I part with them.
Yeah. Yeah.
My personal theory was that the Brewers traded for Asturi Ruiz to trade him to the A's.
Oh, that's funny. I buy that.
but yeah, after a while it would be hard to win trades because people would know exactly what you're looking at. They could just call up
Yeah.
your system and just be like, let me
There
go on
should be some
Savant.
variance in, when I say stick to your process does not have to be static. Like your process
Yeah.
could be like 10% of the time I do a high variance thing or something like that. Like
Uh-huh.
it could be defined stochastically.
Yeah. And just
But
because we're starting with the Savant data doesn't mean we haven't post-processed that into
exactly,
our own stuff.
it's all how you interpret the stuff. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, it's been fascinating, Max. It's been great to talk to you. We need to do this again. Stuff Plus needs to have a meeting. We're gonna have an organizational meeting. Yes, Smash the like button, subscribe to our channel. Thank you to Max Bay for coming and sitting with us and talking to us about all things analytics and Stuff Plus and the future of baseball. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Zeno.
And we'll be back with Rates and Barrels on Tuesday.